Barren, empty horizon. Matilda Mattie Mercer had spent her whole life keeping her land safe, but when Garrett Boone rode onto her property, all quiet strength and a past he wouldn't talk about, she knew her hardest battle had just begun. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't a skin you too." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Dust and Wind. The wind carried more than just dust across the parched plains. It carried whispers of change, of uncertainty, of a life Mattie Mercer wasn't sure she was ready for. At 58, her life was etched into the very soil of the Mercer Ranch, a legacy passed down through generations, a testament to grit and an unwavering spirit. Her hands, calloused and strong, bore the marks of countless sunrises and sunsets spent wresting a living from this unforgiving land. Her face, framed by strands of graying auburn hair usually tucked beneath a worn Stetson, was a roadmap of hardship and resilience. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a depth of experience that few could fathom. Mattie stood on the porch of the ranch house, a weathered two-story structure that had stood sentinel against the elements for over a century. It was a sturdy, practical building, built for function, not beauty, much like Mattie herself. The wood creaked under her boots, a familiar symphony of age and endurance. The sprawling landscape unfolded before her, a panorama of rolling hills, dotted with tenacious scrub brush and the occasional defiant mesquite tree. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, sage, and the faint, ever-present aroma of cattle. Today, though, the familiar comfort of the scene was disrupted. A plume of dust on the horizon signaled an approaching rider, a rare occurrence this far out. Mattie's ranch was isolated, a deliberate choice made by her grandfather, a man who valued solitude and self-reliance above all else. Visitors were infrequent and rarely welcome. As the rider drew closer, Mattie's hand instinctively moved to the worn leather holster at her hip, the weight of the Colt Peacemaker a familiar reassurance. It wasn't that she expected trouble, not exactly, but out here, a woman alone had to be prepared for anything. The rider, a silhouette against the blazing afternoon sun, finally resolved into a tall, lean figure astride a magnificent chestnut mare. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture radiating a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. Mattie watched him, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied the ruggedness of his attire: worn denim, a faded chambray shirt, and a dusty, wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He approached the porch slowly, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. It was then that Mattie got a clear look at his face. It was a face carved from the same harsh landscape that surrounded them, all sharp angles and hard lines. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, were framed by thick, dark lashes, and they held a gaze that was both intense and unsettling. There was a weariness in those eyes, a hint of something haunted, something that made Mattie's breath catch in her throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. It was a voice that spoke of long days in the saddle, of whispered conversations around campfires, of a life lived on the edge. "Name's Garrett Boone." Mattie remained silent for a moment, studying him, assessing him. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were screaming at her. This man was trouble, the kind of trouble that could unravel the carefully constructed life she had built. But there was something else, too, a flicker of something that resonated deep within her, a sense of recognition, of a shared understanding of the hardships and the loneliness of this life. "Mattie Mercer," she finally replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "This is my ranch." It was a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership, a subtle warning. Garrett Boone nodded, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the well-maintained fences, the sturdy corrals, the healthy-looking cattle grazing in the distance. "I can see that," he said, his eyes returning to hers. Fine piece of land you got here. It is, Maddie agreed, her hand still resting near her holster. What brings you to it, Mr. Boone? He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were searching for the right words. Heard tell you might be needin' a hand, he said, his voice low. Heard you lost your foreman a few months back. It was true. Her foreman, old Jed, had passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving a void in Maddie's life and a significant gap in the ranch's operation. She had been managing with the help of a few loyal but aging ranch hands, but it was a struggle. She needed someone young, strong, experienced. Someone like Garrett Boone. But she couldn't afford to trust him, not yet. Not with the way her heart was hammering against her ribs, not with the way his presence disrupted the carefully ordered tranquility of her world. I managed, she said, her voice tight. Who told you? I was looking. He gave a slight shrug, a movement that seemed to ripple through his entire body. Word travels, he said. Out here, news is a precious commodity. Maddie knew that was true. The vast distances between ranches and settlements meant that information, gossip, and rumors were carried on the wind, passed from rider to rider, shared around crackling fires and in dimly lit saloons. I ain't a skin for charity, Garrett continued, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. I can pull my weight. I know cattle, I know horses, and I know this land. He paused, a hint of steel entering his voice. And I ain't afraid of hard work. Maddie studied him, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of an ulterior motive. She saw nothing but a weariness that mirrored her own, a quiet strength that she found herself reluctantly admiring. He crossed his arms, watching her. You don't trust me, do you? He murmured. That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to. The use of sweetheart, so casual, so unexpected, sent a fresh wave of heat through her. It was a challenge, a subtle assertion of his presence, a reminder that he was not a man to be easily dismissed. And the wind picked up, catching in the hem of my skirt, rustling against the wooden walls of the homestead, and the air felt hot, dry, and loaded. Chapter 2. Shadows across the sun-drenched plains. Maddie straightened, her back stiffening against the implied challenge in his tone, and the casual endearment that felt anything but casual. Trust is earned, Mr. Boone, she said, her voice crisp, the years of running a ranch and dealing with men of all sorts hardening her tone. And out here, it's a precious commodity, more valuable than gold or water. He gave a slow nod, his blue eyes never leaving hers. I understand that, ma'am. And I aim to earn it. He paused, letting the silence stretch between them, punctuated only by the creak of the porch swing and the distant lowing of cattle. But I reckon a man's gotta eat, and a horse needs a place to rest. I'm willing to work for my keep, prove my worth, before you make any decisions. It was a reasonable offer, and Maddie knew it. She was short-handed, the work was piling up, and the upcoming cattle drive was looming large in her mind. She needed help, and Garrett Boone, despite the unsettling effect he had on her, looked like he could provide it. But the unease remained, a knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. You can stay the night, she said finally, her voice grudging. In the bunkhouse. Supper's at sundown. Don't expect any special treatment. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or relief crossed his face, but it was gone so quickly that Maddie couldn't be sure. Fair enough, ma'am, he said. I appreciate the opportunity. He turned to retrieve his horse, and Maddie watched him, her mind racing. The way he moved, with that effortless grace, spoke of years spent in the saddle. The way he handled his horse, with a gentle firmness, showed a deep understanding of animals. He was a man of the land, no doubt about it. But was he a man she could trust? She watched as he led his mare towards the bunkhouse, a small, sturdy building a short distance from the main house. It was a simple structure, with a few narrow cots, a rough-hewn table, and a pot-bellied stove for warmth during the cold desert nights. It was a far cry from the comforts of a town, but it was enough for a man used to a hard life. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the plains, Maddie went inside to prepare supper. The kitchen was her domain, a place where she could find solace in the familiar routines of cooking. The scent of simmering beans and frying bacon filled the air, a comforting aroma that usually calmed her nerves. But tonight, the familiar scents did little to ease the tension that coiled within her. She found herself thinking about Garrett Boone, about the way he looked at her, about the way his voice made her skin tingle. It was unsettling, this unfamiliar stirring of emotions, this reawakening of something she thought she had buried long ago. She had been a widow for over 20 years, her husband, Thomas, having succumbed to a fever that had swept through the territory like a wildfire. She had mourned him, deeply and truly, but she had also learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on her own strength and resilience. She had built a life for herself, a hard life, but a good one. And now, this stranger had ridden into her life, stirring up dust and emotions she had thought long settled. She glanced out the kitchen window, her gaze drawn to the bunkhouse. A faint light flickered within, casting a warm glow against the gathering darkness. He was in there, settling in, making himself at home. She wondered about his past, about the secrets he carried, about the reasons that had brought him to her doorstep. She set the table, her movements automatic, her mind still preoccupied with the enigmatic Garrett Boone. She placed 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses. It was a habit, a lingering reminder of the days when she had shared her meals with Thomas. Tonight, she would be sharing her meal with a stranger, a man who both intrigued and unsettled her. As the last rays of sunlight faded, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Garrett Boone emerged from the bunkhouse. He had washed up, and his dark hair was still damp, clinging to his forehead. He had changed into a clean shirt, but the worn denim and dusty boots remained, a testament to his life as a working man. He approached the house slowly, his boots making a soft thud on the wooden porch. He paused at the door, hesitating for a moment, before knocking lightly. "Come in," Maddie called out, her voice betraying none of the nervousness she felt. He opened the door and stepped inside, his presence filling the small kitchen. He seemed larger in the enclosed space, more imposing, more dangerous. "Smells good, ma'am," he said, his gaze taking in the simple but hearty meal she had prepared. "It's just beans and bacon," Maddie said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Nothing fancy." "Fancy ain't always what a man needs," he replied, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was a warmth in his gaze now, a hint of gratitude, that made Maddie's heart skip a beat. They sat down at the table, a silence falling between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was charged with an unspoken awareness, a tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. Maddie found herself studying him, noticing the details she had noticed before, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the small scar that ran along his jawline, the calluses on his hands that matched her own. He ate with a quiet appreciation, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He didn't speak much, but his eyes spoke volumes. They followed her every move, watching her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely seen. "So," Maddie said finally, breaking the silence, "you said you know this land." He nodded, taking a sip of water. "I've ridden through these parts before," he said. "Spent some time in the Arizona territory. Worked on a few ranches." "What kind of ranches?" Maddie pressed, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "All kinds," he said vaguely. "Big ones, small ones. Some legal, some less so." There it was, the first hint of something hidden, something dangerous. Maddie's instincts had been right. This man had a past he wasn't eager to share. "Less so?" she questioned, her voice sharp. "What's that supposed to mean?" He looked at her then, his blue eyes piercing, his expression unreadable. "It means I've seen things, done things, that I ain't proud of," he said quietly. "But I'm trying to put that behind me. I'm looking for a fresh start, a chance to do things right." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Maddie searched his face, trying to discern the truth from the lies, the reality from the shadows. And the shadows seemed to grow, the dim light of the oil lamp casting the room in a half-light, blurring the lines. Chapter 3. A stranger's arrival under a crimson sky. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions, with the weight of his admission. Maddie pushed a stray bean around her plate with her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. The flickering lamplight danced in his eyes, making it impossible to read their depths. Was he telling the truth? Was he truly seeking redemption? Or was this just another elaborate lie, a carefully crafted facade to gain her trust? "And what makes you think you'll find that here?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze fixed on his face. "On my ranch?" He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I don't know," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "Maybe it's the land. Maybe it's something else." The something else hung unspoken between them, a palpable tension that made the air crackle. Maddie felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that both terrified and intrigued her. "This ranch is my life, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice firm, regaining her composure. "I've worked hard to build it, to protect it. I won't let anyone threaten that." "I understand, ma'am," he said, his voice equally firm. "And I wouldn't dream of threatening it. I'm just asking for a chance to prove myself, to show you that I can be an asset, not a liability." His words were sincere. She could feel it. But sincerity didn't always equate to honesty. She had learned that lesson the hard way, over years of dealing with men who promised the world and delivered nothing but heartache. "You said you've done things you're not proud of," she said, changing the subject, probing deeper into the shadows of his past. "What kind of things?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were now clasped tightly on the table. He looked at them, at the calluses and the scars, as if they held the answers to her questions. "Things that go against the law," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Things that hurt people." The admission, though vague, sent a chill through Maddie. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it, hearing the regret in his voice, made it all the more real. "Were you an outlaw?" she asked, the words sounding harsh and accusatory in the quiet kitchen. He didn't answer immediately. He looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a pain that seemed to reach deep into his soul. "I rode with some unsavory characters," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Did some things I wish I could take back. But I never killed anyone, if that's what you're asking." Maddie wasn't sure if she believed him, but she saw the truth in his eyes, the genuine remorse. He had been involved in something bad, something that had left its mark on him. But he wasn't a cold-blooded killer. At least, she didn't think he was. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "Why did you walk away from that life?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It wasn't a life," he said, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "It was a slow death. I saw good men die for nothing. I saw the darkness that can consume a man's soul. And I realized I didn't want to end up like them." His words resonated with Maddie, striking a chord deep within her. She, too, had seen the darkness, the harsh realities of life on the frontier. She had seen good people driven to desperate measures by poverty, by desperation, by the sheer will to survive. "So you came here," she said, stating the obvious. He nodded. "I heard about your ranch. Heard you were a strong woman, a fair woman. Heard you needed help." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I figured maybe I could find some peace here. Some redemption." The word, redemption, hung in the air, a fragile hope, a desperate plea. Maddie felt a stirring of empathy for this man, this stranger who had ridden into her life, carrying the weight of his past. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the yearning for something more. She also saw the strength, the resilience, the quiet determination that had allowed him to survive. He was a complex man, a mixture of darkness and light, of regret and hope. And despite her reservations, despite the risks, she found herself drawn to him, drawn to the possibility of something more. The crimson sky outside had deepened into a rich, velvety purple, studded with the first faint glimmers of stars. The silence of the prairie night had settled around the house, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. It was a silence that could be both comforting and unsettling, a silence that amplified the unspoken emotions swirling between them. Maddie made her decision. "All right, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice firm, but with a hint of warmth. "You can stay, but you'll work hard, you'll follow my rules, and you'll earn my trust. One wrong move, and you're gone. Understand?" His blue eyes met hers, a spark of gratitude, of relief, flickering within them. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice sincere. "I understand. And I won't let you down." He rose slightly from his chair, as though he would offer to help clean, but sat back down almost instantly. I needed to make my position clear. He could stay, but he would be watched. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The following days settled into a rhythm, a delicate dance of work and observation. Garrett Boone proved to be everything he had claimed: a skilled horseman, a tireless worker, and a man who understood the land. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient, and worked until long after the sun had set, his energy seemingly boundless. He mended fences, repaired corrals, tended to the cattle, and handled the horses with a gentle firmness that spoke of years of experience. Maddie watched him closely, her gaze unwavering, her senses heightened. She looked for any sign of deception, any hint of the darkness he had alluded to, any indication that he was not who he claimed to be. But she found nothing. He was respectful, almost deferential, always addressing her as ma'am and keeping a respectful distance. He spoke little, preferring to let his actions speak for him. But the unspoken words hung heavy between them, the weight of his past, the uncertainty of his future, the simmering attraction that neither of them could deny. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a lingering gaze filled with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something that made her heart flutter. It was in the way he handed her a tool, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. It was in the way he listened to her instructions, his blue eyes focused intently on her face, as if he were memorizing every detail. Maddie found herself increasingly drawn to him, despite her reservations, despite her better judgment. She admired his strength, his resilience, his quiet competence. She appreciated his willingness to work hard, to prove himself, to earn her trust. And she couldn't deny the physical attraction, the way her body responded to his presence, the way her heart beat faster whenever he was near. It was a dangerous game she was playing, she knew. She was a woman alone, running a ranch in a harsh and unforgiving land. She couldn't afford to be distracted, to be vulnerable. She had to be strong, to be in control. But Garrett Boone was disrupting her carefully ordered world, challenging her assumptions, making her question everything she thought she knew about herself. One evening, after a long day of working together to repair a section of broken fence, they found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking panorama of orange, red, and purple that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of crickets chirping. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Garrett said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Maddie nodded, her heart aching with a bittersweet longing. "It is," she agreed. "But it's also harsh, unforgiving. It takes everything you have to survive out here." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the fading light. "You've survived," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've built something remarkable here." "I had help," Maddie said, her voice tinged with sadness. "My husband, Thomas, he was a good man. A strong man. He taught me everything I know." "He must have been," Garrett said, his gaze gentle, understanding, "to have earned the love of a woman like you." The compliment, so unexpected, so sincere, caught Maddie off guard. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth spread through her chest. It had been a long time since a man had spoken to her like that, since she had felt this stirring of emotions. "He died young," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the pain of the loss still raw after all these years. "Fever. Took him quickly." "I'm sorry," Garrett said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "It's a hard thing, losing someone you love." He knew, she realized. He had experienced loss, too. It was in his eyes, in the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. "You said you've seen things, done things you're not proud of," she said, changing the subject, probing once again into the shadows of his past.
"Tell me about it."
He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to revisit those painful memories. But he knew he owed her the truth, or at least a part of it. "I rode with a gang," he said finally, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "We robbed banks, trains, stagecoaches. We lived outside the law, answerable to no one." Maddie listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected as much, but hearing the details, hearing the stark reality of his past, was still a shock.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you choose that life?" He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to convey a mixture of regret and resignation. "It seemed like the only option at the time," he said. "I was young, angry, lost. I fell in with the wrong crowd. They offered me excitement, adventure, a sense of belonging. I didn't realize until it was too late that it was all a lie." "What changed?" Maddie asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity piqued. "I saw a man die," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "A good man, a friend. He was shot in the back during a robbery gone wrong. He died in my arms, begging me to get out, to make something of myself." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of guilt and remorse. Maddie felt a surge of empathy for him, for the pain he had endured, for the choices he had made. "So you left," she said, stating the obvious. He nodded. "I rode away that night, and I never looked back. I've been trying to outrun my past ever since." He looked at her, in the encroaching twilight, a plea and a hope and 1,000 other things she couldn't quite name swimming. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Troubled Past. "And you think you can outrun it here?" Maddie asked, her voice gentle, but the question laced with the inherent doubt that still clung to her like the scent of dust on her clothes. "On my ranch?" He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers, as if seeking an answer, a reassurance that she couldn't quite give. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "Maybe not outrun it completely. But maybe I can make peace with it. Maybe I can build something new, something good, to balance out the bad." The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty of his admission, touched Maddie deeply. She saw the struggle he was facing, the internal battle between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. It was a battle she understood, a battle she had fought herself, in her own way. "We all have ghosts, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice soft, her gaze holding his. "Things we've done, things we regret. The past is a part of us. It shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us." Her words, spoken from the depths of her own experience, seemed to offer him a glimmer of hope, a lifeline in the turbulent sea of his emotions. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. "Thank you, ma'am," he said finally, his voice husky with emotion. For understanding." "I try," Maddie said, a small smile playing on her lips. "But I'm still watching you, Mr. Boone. Don't forget that." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I wouldn't expect anything less, ma'am," he said. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The days continued to pass, the rhythm of ranch life settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Garrett worked tirelessly, his dedication and skill undeniable. He was proving to be a valuable asset, just as he had promised. But the undercurrent of tension remained, the unspoken attraction simmering beneath the surface, the weight of his past casting a long shadow. One afternoon, while they were riding out to check on a remote section of the herd, a sudden storm blew in, a typical desert squall that appeared out of nowhere, turning the sky a menacing shade of gray. The wind whipped around them, carrying dust and debris, making it difficult to see. The rain came down in sheets, soaking them to the bone within minutes. "We need to find shelter," Maddie shouted over the roar of the wind, her voice strained. Garrett nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape. He spotted a small, rocky overhang a short distance away, a natural shelter formed by an outcropping of rock. "This way," he yelled, urging his horse forward. They rode towards the overhang, the horses struggling against the wind and rain. They reached the shelter just as the storm intensified, the thunder booming overhead, the lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, blinding flashes. They dismounted, their clothes soaked, their bodies shivering from the cold. The overhang provided some protection from the rain, but the wind still howled around them, carrying the chill deep into their bones. "We'll have to wait it out," Maddie said, her teeth chattering. "These storms usually pass quickly." They huddled together under the overhang, the horses standing close by, seeking warmth and protection. The close proximity, the shared danger, the raw power of the storm, created an intimacy that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. Maddie found herself acutely aware of Garrett's presence, of the warmth of his body, of the scent of wet leather and horse that clung to him. He was so close, she could feel the rise and fall of his chest, hear the steady beat of his heart. He looked at her, his blue eyes dark and intense in the dim light. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice concerned. "I'm cold," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I'll be fine." He hesitated for a moment, then, without a word, he took off his heavy, soaked coat and draped it around her shoulders. The gesture, so simple, so unexpected, sent a wave of warmth through her, both physical and emotional. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled by the thick fabric of the coat. It smelled of him, of leather and sweat and something indefinably masculine, a scent that was both comforting and arousing. They stood there in silence, huddled together, the storm raging around them. The close proximity, the shared vulnerability, the unspoken emotions, created a palpable tension that crackled in the air. Maddie looked up at him, her gaze meeting his. She saw the desire in his eyes, the longing, the yearning for something more. And she saw the fear, the hesitation, the awareness of the risks. He leaned forward, only slightly, as lightning flashed, outlining him in a sudden, bright white light against the darkness of the storm. Chapter 6. The Dance of Distrust and Desire. The lightning illuminated the raw, untamed landscape, and for a fleeting second, illuminated the raw, untamed emotions that flickered in Garrett's eyes. It was a look that mirrored her own internal conflict, a battle between the ingrained caution of a life lived on the edge of survival and the undeniable pull of a connection that defied logic and reason. He didn't move further, didn't speak. The moment hung suspended, heavy with unspoken desires and the very real constraints of their situation. Maddie was acutely aware of the warmth of his coat around her shoulders, the lingering scent of him that clung to the fabric, a tangible reminder of his presence. "This storm," Maddie began, her voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the howling wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. "It reminds me of the one that took Thomas." The admission was unexpected, even to herself. She hadn't spoken of that night in years, the memory buried deep beneath layers of grief, and the stoic facade she had cultivated to survive. Garrett's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a compassion that reached deep into her soul. "Tell me about it," he said, his voice gentle, encouraging. And so she did. She spoke of the sudden onset of the fever, of the desperate ride to the nearest doctor, miles away, of the agonizing wait, of the crushing realization that she was losing him. She spoke of the helplessness, the grief, the overwhelming sense of loss that had threatened to consume her. Garrett listened patiently, his presence a silent anchor in the storm of her emotions. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, just listened with a quiet intensity that made her feel heard, understood. "It was a long time ago," she said finally, her voice hoarse with emotion. "But some wounds, they never fully heal." "No," he agreed, his voice barely a whisper. "They don't. But they can fade. They can become a part of who you are, a reminder of your strength, your resilience. His words resonated with her, a truth she had learned through years of hardship and survival. She had carried the pain of Thomas's death with her, a constant ache in her heart, but she had also learned to live with it, to build a life around it. "And what about your wounds, Mr. Boone?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "The ones you carry from your past?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the raging storm outside. "Mine are different," he said, his voice guarded. "They're self-inflicted. The result of choices I made, mistakes I can't undo." "We all make mistakes," Maddie said, her voice firm. "It's what we do afterward that matters. It's whether we learn from them, whether we try to make amends." He turned back to her, his blue eyes searching hers. "Do you believe that, ma'am?" he asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "Do you believe a man can truly change?" "I believe it's possible," she said, her voice unwavering. "Difficult, but possible. It takes courage, determination, and a willingness to face your demons." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The distrust began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative understanding, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability. The storm began to subside, the thunder fading to a distant rumble, the rain softening to a drizzle. The clouds began to part, revealing patches of clear sky, the first stars beginning to glimmer in the twilight. "It's passing," Garrett said, his voice low. Maddie nodded, her gaze still locked with his. The physical storm was ending, but the emotional storm within her was still raging. The attraction, the desire, the longing, it was all still there, stronger than ever. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. It was a tentative gesture, a question, a silent plea. Maddie didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. His fingers brushed hers, a light, fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a spark, an ignition, a moment of undeniable connection. But it was also a moment fraught with danger, with the potential for heartbreak, with the weight of their pasts and the uncertainty of their future. And as the last of the rain pattered against the rocky overhang, a different kind of tension began to build. It clung heavier in the air, drawing a sharp, almost painful contrast between the freshly cleansed world outside and the muddied, uncertain terrain of their hearts. Chapter 7. Beneath the watchful gaze of the moon. The touch lingered, a silent conversation between calloused hands, a testament to lives lived in hardship and resilience. The air, washed clean by the storm, felt thick and heavy with unspoken desires, with the weight of their pasts, with the precariousness of their present. Maddie's breath caught in her throat, her senses heightened, her body acutely aware of his proximity. The warmth of his hand, even that fleeting touch, sent a shiver through her, a reawakening of sensations she had thought long dormant. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, spoke volumes. They reflected a longing that mirrored her own, a desire that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the dripping of water from the rocks and the distant murmur of the retreating storm. The moon, now free from the clouds, cast a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating their faces, highlighting the lines of weariness and the flicker of something new, something fragile and tentative. "We should get back," Maddie said finally, her voice a husky whisper, the words a reluctant acknowledgement of the reality that awaited them. He nodded, his hand slowly withdrawing from hers, the warmth fading, leaving a lingering ache in its wake. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice equally low, equally strained. They mounted their horses, the movement stiff and awkward, the unspoken emotions hanging heavy between them. The ride back to the ranch was silent, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the implications of that brief, charged moment. The moon, a silent witness to their unspoken desires, cast long, dancing shadows across the plains, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal, something magical. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. As they approached the ranch, the lights from the house glowed warmly in the distance, a beacon of safety, of normalcy, of the life Maddie had built. But tonight, even the familiar comfort of home felt different, altered by the presence of Garrett Boone, by the undeniable connection that had formed between them. They unsaddled their horses in silence, their movements practiced and efficient, the routine a welcome distraction from the turmoil of their emotions. They tended to the animals, ensuring their comfort, before heading towards the house. "I'll see you in the morning," Maddie said, her voice hesitant, her gaze avoiding his. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice low, his eyes lingering on her face. She turned to go, but he stopped her, his hand gently touching her arm. The touch, though light, sent a fresh wave of heat through her, a reminder of the electricity that sparked between them. "Maddie," he said, his voice a rough whisper, the sound of her name on his lips sending a shiver down her spine. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were filled with a mixture of desire and uncertainty, a reflection of her own internal conflict. He began, then hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "I don't want to overstep." "I know," she said, her voice barely audible. She understood his hesitation, his awareness of the risks, of the potential for heartbreak. She felt it too, the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of their pasts. He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses, his warmth enveloping her. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was tender, reverent, a stark contrast to the ruggedness of his appearance. "You're a remarkable woman, Maddie Mercer," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Strong, resilient, beautiful." The compliment, so unexpected, so sincere, brought tears to her eyes. It had been a long time since she had felt seen, truly seen for who she was. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to feel anything. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation, any hint of resistance. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her heart pounding, her body trembling, her mind racing. And in that moment, the moon was the only witness. It saw everything, the silent yearning, the tentative hope, the decision. And, as he leaned in very slightly more, the first, faint sound of a whippoorwill calling out across the vast, open range. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty and Freedom. The whippoorwill's call, lonely and evocative, seemed to hang in the air, a poignant soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Maddie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the pounding of blood in her ears. His nearness, the warmth of his breath on her cheek, the intensity of his gaze, it was all overwhelming, intoxicating, terrifying. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He held himself back, a restraint that spoke volumes about his character, about his respect for her, about the internal battle he was clearly waging. It was a battle she understood, a battle she was fighting herself. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice trembling, the name a plea, a warning, a question. His eyes searched hers, seeking an answer, a reassurance, a permission he wouldn't take without her consent. She saw the desire, the longing, the yearning, but she also saw the respect, the restraint, the awareness of the complexities of their situation. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice a rough whisper, his breath warm against her skin. "That you have reservations." "It's not just reservations," she said, her voice honest, raw. "It's everything. My life, this ranch, your past, it's a lot to consider." "I know," he agreed, his thumb gently stroking her cheek, the touch sending shivers down her spine. "But I also know this," he gestured vaguely between them, "is real. It's something worth fighting for." The words, spoken with such conviction, such sincerity, resonated deep within her. She couldn't deny the truth of his statement. The connection between them, the undeniable attraction, the shared understanding, it was real. It was something she hadn't experienced in years, something she thought she had lost forever. But the risks were also real. The potential for heartbreak, the threat to her carefully constructed life, the uncertainty of his past, it all weighed heavily on her mind. What if she began, then hesitated, unable to voice her deepest fear? What if he was still involved in something dangerous? What if his past came back to haunt him, to haunt her? What if she was making a terrible mistake? He seemed to understand her unspoken question. "I'm not running anymore, Maddie," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "I'm done with that life. I swear it." She searched his eyes, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of doubt. She saw nothing but sincerity, a raw honesty that seemed to emanate from the depths of his soul. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice a whisper, the words a fragile hope, a tentative trust. "Then believe this," he said, his voice husky with emotion. He leaned in, finally closing the distance between them, his lips gently brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a question asked and answered. It was a spark, an ignition, a moment of undeniable connection. It was a promise, a commitment, a leap of faith. Maddie responded, her lips parting slightly under his, her arms slowly rising to encircle his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of pent-up emotions, a culmination of weeks of unspoken desires. The world around them faded away, the ranch, the moon, the whippoorwill's call, all disappearing into the background. There was only the two of them, locked in an embrace, lost in the moment, surrendering to the overwhelming force of their attraction. But even in the midst of this passionate embrace, a nagging voice of caution whispered in the back of Maddie's mind. It was a voice that reminded her of the risks, of the potential for pain, of the fragility of trust. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the spell, the unmistakable sound of approaching horses, multiple horses, riding hard. The sound, jarring and unexpected, sent a jolt of fear through Maddie. Garrett broke the kiss, his head snapping up, his senses instantly alert. He listened intently, his body tensing, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. And in that instant, everything beautiful about the night fractured, revealing a dark and threatening undercurrent. Chapter 9. Scars that run deeper than skin. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, closer, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the hard-packed earth a clear indication of their rapid approach. Garrett's hand remained on his gun, his body poised, ready for action. His eyes, no longer filled with tenderness and desire, were now sharp, alert, assessing the threat. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Maddie hesitated, her own fear battling with the fierce protectiveness of her home, her land, her life. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice grim. "Just get inside.
Now."
He gave her a gentle push towards the house, his touch firm, insistent. Maddie, realizing the seriousness of the situation, obeyed. She ran towards the house, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She reached the porch, glancing back at Garrett. He was standing his ground, a solitary figure silhouetted against the moonlit landscape, his gun drawn, his body tense, waiting. He looked like a man who had faced danger many times before, a man who knew how to fight, how to survive. The riders were close now, visible in the moonlight, a group of 5 or 6 men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hats, their intentions unknown. Maddie's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the lead rider's horse, a distinctive black stallion with a white blaze on its face. It was the horse of Jedediah Stone, the owner of the neighboring ranch, a man known for his ruthlessness and his long-standing feud with the Mercer family. The feud had started generations ago, a dispute over water rights, a conflict that had escalated over the years, fueled by pride, greed, and a thirst for revenge. Maddie had tried to maintain a fragile peace with Stone, avoiding confrontation, focusing on her own ranch, her own life. But she knew he was a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to get what he wanted. The riders reined in their horses a short distance from the house, their presence menacing, their silence threatening. Jedediah Stone dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Garrett. He was a large man, built like a bull, with a weathered face and a cruel smile. Well, Stone said, his voice a gravelly drawl, his gaze sweeping over Garrett, taking in his stance his gun. Look what the cat dragged in. A stray dog, sniffing around my neighbor's property. This is Mercer land, Stone, Garrett said, his voice calm, steady, his gun unwavering. State your business. Stone chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. My business is with the woman, he said, his gaze shifting to Maddie, who was standing on the porch, her own rifle in her hands. I heard she was short-handed. Thought I'd offer my assistance. The offer was laced with sarcasm, with a thinly veiled threat. Maddie knew what he was after. He wanted her land, her water, her ranch. He had been trying to acquire it for years, using intimidation, harassment, and even sabotage. I don't need your assistance, Stone, Maddie said, her voice firm, her grip tightening on her rifle. Get off my property. Stone ignored her, his eyes returning to Garrett. Who are you anyway? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Some hired gun? Some drifter looking for easy pickings? I'm the foreman, Garrett said, his voice unwavering. And I'm telling you to leave.
Now.
Stone laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. You think you can tell me what to do? On my land? This ain't your land, Stone, Garrett said, his voice hardening. And you know it. The tension was palpable, the air thick with animosity, with the threat of violence. The other riders shifted in their saddles, their hands moving towards their own weapons. It was a standoff, a dangerous game of wills, a moment that could erupt into bloodshed at any second. Maddie knew she had to do something to defuse the situation before it escalated out of control. She stepped forward, her rifle still raised, her gaze fixed on Stone. Jedediah, she said, her voice calm but firm. This has gone on long enough. We can settle this peacefully. There's no need for bloodshed. Stone looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and something else. A flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps regret. It was a fleeting emotion, quickly replaced by his usual arrogance. He spat, a brown stream landing near my feet. There ain't nothing to settle, Mercer. Except in the score. Chapter 10. A glimmer of hope in the barren lands. Stone's words, laced with venom and the bitter taste of a long-standing feud, hung heavy in the air. The score he spoke of was a tangled web of grievances, real and imagined, that had been passed down through generations, a festering wound that refused to heal. There's always something to settle, Jedediah, Maddie said, her voice steady, refusing to be intimidated by his bluster. We can talk. We can find a way to coexist. Stone scoffed, his eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over her, dismissive and contemptuous. Coexist? He sneered. You think I want to coexist with the likes of you? With the Mercers who stole my water, my land, my legacy? That's not how it happened, Stone, Maddie said, her voice tight, the old anger simmering beneath the surface. Your father and mine had an agreement. It was legal, it was fair. Fair? Stone roared, his face turning red with rage. It was a lie, a cheat. Your father robbed mine blind, left him with nothing. That's not true, Maddie said, her voice rising, her grip tightening on her rifle. And you know it. This feud has gone on long enough. It's time to end it. Stone looked at her, his eyes filled with a hatred that was both terrifying and strangely pathetic. He was a man consumed by his past, blinded by his anger, unable to see reason, unable to move on. It'll end when I have what's rightfully mine, he said, his voice low and menacing. Your land, your water, your ranch. Everything. You'll have to kill me first, Maddie said, her voice unwavering, her gaze fixed on his. Stone smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. That can be arranged, he said. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the threat of violence. The other riders, Stone's loyal henchmen, shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering over their weapons, waiting for their leader's command. Garrett remained calm, his gun steady, his eyes focused on Stone, assessing the threat, calculating the odds. He was ready to defend Maddie, to defend the ranch, even if it meant facing overwhelming odds. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a voice that was both unexpected and strangely familiar. "That's enough, Jedediah." The voice came from one of Stone's men, a young man, barely out of his teens, with a hesitant demeanor and a troubled expression. He was the newest member of Stone's gang, a kid named Billy, who had joined up more out of desperation than any real loyalty to Stone. Stone turned to him, his eyes blazing with fury. "What did you say?" he growled, his voice dangerously low. Billy swallowed hard, his face pale, but he stood his ground. "I said, that's enough," he repeated, his voice trembling but firm. "This ain't right. We ain't here to kill nobody." Stone stared at him, his expression incredulous, his rage simmering. "You dare to defy me?"
he roared.
"You dare to question my orders?" "I ain't questioning your orders," Billy said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm just saying this ain't what I signed up for. I ain't no killer." The other riders looked at Billy, then at Stone, their expressions uncertain, their loyalty wavering. They were a mixed bunch, some hardened criminals, some just desperate men looking for work, for a way to survive. They weren't necessarily killers either. Stone saw the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation, the potential for mutiny. He knew he was losing control, that his authority was being challenged. He had to act quickly, to reassert his dominance. He turned back to Maddie, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating rage. "This ain't over, Mercer," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so accommodating." He turned and mounted his horse, his movements stiff with anger. He glared at his men, his gaze a silent threat. "Let's go," he barked, his voice harsh. The riders, relieved to avoid a confrontation, followed him, their horses kicking up dust as they rode away. Billy, the young man who had dared to speak up, cast a final, apologetic glance at Maddie before following his companions. And then, the dust settled, and with it, a quiet descended. It wrapped around the ranch, broken only by the deep, slow breaths of two people caught on opposite sides of a fight they had not started. Chapter 11. The storm breaks and secrets unfold. The dust settled, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, a silence punctuated only by the receding sound of hooves and the ragged breathing of Maddie and Garrett. The immediate threat had passed, but the tension remained, a palpable reminder of the simmering feud and the precariousness of their situation. Maddie lowered her rifle, her arms trembling from the adrenaline, her legs feeling weak. She looked at Garrett, his gun still drawn, his eyes scanning the horizon, ensuring that Stone and his men were truly gone. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse, her gaze meeting his. "For standing with me." He holstered his gun, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I am," she said, managing a weak smile. "A little shaken, but all right." She paused, her gaze shifting towards the direction where Stone and his men had disappeared. "That was close." "Too close," Garrett agreed, his voice grim. "Stone's a dangerous man. He won't give up easily." "I know," Maddie said, her voice tinged with resignation. "He's been after my land for years. This feud, it's been going on for generations." "What started it?" Garrett asked, his curiosity piqued. Maddie sighed, leaning against the porch railing, her body weary, her mind still reeling from the confrontation. "It's a long story," she said, her voice filled with the weight of history. "A dispute over water rights back when my grandfather and his father first settled this land. There was a drought, a bad one. Water was scarce, tempers were high. They made an agreement, a sharing of the water from the creek that runs through both our properties. But Stone's father always claimed he was cheated, that my grandfather took more than his fair share." "And was he?" Garrett asked, his eyes searching hers. Maddie shook her head. No, she said firmly. My grandfather was a hard man, but he was fair. He kept meticulous records. Everything was documented. But Stone's father was a bitter, resentful man. He couldn't accept the agreement. He couldn't let it go. And he passed that bitterness, that hatred, down to his son. And now Jedediah carries the torch, Garrett said, his voice filled with understanding. Exactly, Maddie agreed. He's obsessed with getting what he believes is rightfully his. He won't rest until he has it all. He's going to have to go through me first, Garrett said, his voice hardening, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. The statement, so bold, so protective, sent a shiver down Maddie's spine. It was a declaration of loyalty, a commitment to defend her land, to defend their budding relationship. That young man, Maddie said, changing the subject, her mind still on Billy, the hesitant member of Stone's gang. He stood up to Stone. That took courage. Garrett nodded. He did, he agreed. He's not like the others. He doesn't have the stomach for violence. Maybe, he could be an ally, Maddie said, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. Maybe, Garrett said, his voice cautious. But we have to be careful. Stone's a cunning man. He could be using the kid, playing some kind of game. I know, Maddie said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But it's worth exploring. Any advantage we can get, we need to take it. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching, a single rider, coming from the opposite direction of Stone's departure. Maddie and Garrett tensed, their hands instinctively moving towards their weapons. As the rider drew closer, they recognized him. It was Sheriff Thompson, the local law enforcement officer, a man known for his gruff demeanor and his somewhat flexible interpretation of the law. Thompson reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over Maddie and Garrett, his expression unreadable. Heard there was some trouble out here, he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. Stone was here, Maddie said, her voice tight. Threatening me, threatening my ranch. Thompson nodded, his eyes narrowing. I figured as much, he said. He's been stirring up trouble lately. What happened? Maddie and Garrett recounted the events, explaining Stone's accusations, his threats, and Billy's unexpected intervention. Thompson listened patiently, his expression unchanging, his thoughts hidden behind his weathered face. I'll talk to Stone, he said finally, his voice noncommittal. See if I can calm him down. He won't listen to reason, Sheriff, Maddie said, her voice filled with frustration.
He's obsessed.
Thompson shrugged. Maybe not, he said. But I have to try. Can't have folks shooting at each other out here. It's bad for business. His words, so casual, so dismissive of the seriousness of the situation, angered Maddie. This isn't about business, Sheriff, she said, her voice sharp. It's about my life, my livelihood. It's about justice. Thompson looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary cynicism. Justice is a luxury out here, ma'am, he said. Sometimes you have to make your own. He tipped his hat and turned his mount. He hesitated and, without looking back, said, Keep your eyes open and your guns loaded. Chapter 12. Bonds forged in the crucible of fear. Sheriff Thompson's words, Keep your eyes open and your guns loaded, echoed in the stillness, a stark reminder of the precarious reality of their lives. The law, in this remote corner of the world, was a flimsy shield, often more concerned with maintaining a semblance of order than with dispensing true justice. Maddie watched him ride away, her frustration simmering, her sense of vulnerability heightened. She turned to Garrett, his presence a reassuring constant in the midst of the uncertainty. He won't do anything, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. He's in Stone's pocket, like half the town. Garrett nodded, his expression grim. I figured as much, he said. We're on our own. The statement, though blunt, was also strangely comforting. It solidified their bond, their alliance, their shared understanding of the challenges they faced. They were alone, yes, but they were alone together. We should talk, Maddie said, her voice hesitant, her gaze meeting his. About what happened. Before Stone arrived. He understood immediately. He knew she was referring to the kiss, to the unspoken emotions, to the undeniable connection that had formed between them. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. They walked towards the porch, their movements slow, deliberate, the silence between them charged with anticipation and a lingering fear from the recent confrontation. They sat down on the porch swing, the gentle creak of the wood a familiar, comforting sound in the midst of the turmoil. "That kiss," Maddie began, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "It wasn't a mistake, was it?" He reached out, his hand gently covering hers, his touch sending a warmth through her that chased away the lingering chill. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "It wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Inevitable. As if their paths were destined to cross, as if their connection was preordained, as if their hearts were drawn together by an invisible force. Maddie looked up at him, her eyes searching his, seeking reassurance, seeking confirmation. She saw the desire, the longing, the yearning, but she also saw the honesty, the sincerity, the genuine affection. "I haven't felt this way in a long time," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, the words a confession, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to express in years. "Me neither," he said, his voice equally low, equally raw. I thought I was done with feeling anything, that I was too damaged." The word damaged struck a chord within Maddie. She understood that feeling, that sense of being broken, of being unworthy of love, of happiness. She had carried that burden for years, the weight of grief, of loneliness, of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. "We're both damaged," she said, her voice soft, her gaze holding his. "But maybe we can heal each other. Maybe we can find something good, together." The words, spoken with such tentative hope, such fragile vulnerability, brought tears to her eyes. It was a risk, a leap of faith, a surrender to the possibility of something more, something she had thought was lost forever. He leaned in, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was tender, reverent, a stark contrast to the ruggedness of his appearance. "I want that, Maddie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "More than anything." He kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of shared pain, of newfound hope, of a fragile connection forged in the crucible of fear and uncertainty. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their willingness to face the challenges ahead, together. The night was quiet, the stars shining brightly overhead, the moon casting a silvery glow over the landscape. The threat of stone still loomed, the uncertainty of the future remained. But in that moment, in that embrace, Maddie felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of peace, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again, in the arms of this man, this stranger who had ridden into her life and changed it forever. And, in the quiet, with their fear intermingling with a cautious, growing love, Maddie found herself clinging to a fragile, newfound trust. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The following days were a mix of cautious normalcy and underlying tension. Maddie and Garrett worked side by side, tending to the ranch, their shared labor a silent testament to their growing bond. They spoke little of the kiss, of their burgeoning relationship, but the unspoken emotions hung heavy between them, a constant reminder of the connection they had forged. Maddie found herself observing Garrett more closely, not with suspicion, but with a growing affection, a deepening understanding of the man he was. She saw his strength, his resilience, his quiet competence, but she also saw his vulnerability, his pain, his yearning for redemption. One evening, after a long day of work, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a blaze of color, a breathtaking spectacle that never failed to stir Maddie's soul. "You know," Garrett said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "I haven't told you everything about my past." Maddie turned to him, her heart beating faster, her senses alert. She had known there were more secrets, more shadows lurking in his past. She had sensed it, felt it, in the way he sometimes hesitated, in the way his eyes would darken with unspoken memories. "I'm listening," she said, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. He took a deep breath, his expression troubled, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and apprehension. "There was a woman," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Her name was Sarah. We were going to be married." The words hit Maddie like a physical blow, a sharp pang of jealousy, of fear, of uncertainty. She had known, logically, that he must have had relationships in his past, but hearing him speak of another woman, of a lost love, it brought a wave of unexpected emotions. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight, her throat constricted. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain, with a grief that seemed to reach deep into his soul. "She was killed," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "During a robbery. The one I told you about, the one where my friend died." Maddie's heart ached for him, for the loss he had endured, for the guilt he carried. She understood now the depth of his pain, the source of his darkness, the reason he was so desperate for redemption. "I'm so sorry, Garrett," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to cover his. He turned his hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, his grip tight, desperate. "It was my fault," he said, his voice raw with anguish. "If I hadn't been involved in that life, if I hadn't been so reckless, she would still be alive." "It wasn't your fault," Maddie said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't pull the trigger. You didn't make the choices that led to her death." "But I was a part of it," he insisted, his voice filled with self-loathing. "I was complicit. I share the blame." "We all make mistakes, Garrett," Maddie said, her voice gentle, but firm. "We all have regrets. But we can't let the past define us. We have to learn from it, to move on, to find a way to forgive ourselves." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking solace, seeking forgiveness, seeking a way to escape the darkness that haunted him. "I don't know if I can," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Forgive myself." "You have to," Maddie said, her voice unwavering. "For her sake. For your sake. For our sake." The words, spoken with such conviction, such sincerity, seemed to reach him, to penetrate the wall of guilt and self-recrimination he had built around himself. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle raging within him. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice hoarse, his grip tightening on her hand. "I'll try, Maddie. For you." And with that confession, a new layer of vulnerability was exposed. The rawness of his grief, laid bare under the fading light, showed Maddie not just the scars of his past, but the depth of his capacity to feel, to love, and to, perhaps, finally heal. The truth, in all its pain, seemed to clear a space for something stronger to grow between them, something built not on secrets, but on shared burdens and the promise of a different future. Chapter 14. Between the Law and a Lawless Heart. The tentative peace that had settled over the ranch was shattered a few days later by the arrival of a stranger. He rode in on a dusty, weary horse, his clothes travel-stained, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He reined in his horse a short distance from the house, his eyes scanning the property, his posture wary. Maddie and Garrett, who had been working in the corral, saw him approach. Garrett's hand instinctively moved to his gun, his body tensing, his senses alert. "Stay here," he said to Maddie, his voice low and urgent. He walked towards the stranger, his movements slow and deliberate, his gun held loosely at his side. Maddie watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear mingling with a fierce protectiveness of Garrett, of their home, of their fragile new relationship. "Can I help you?" Garrett asked, his voice calm, steady, his eyes fixed on the stranger. The stranger dismounted, his movements slow and stiff, as if he were in pain. He pushed back his hat, revealing a face that was young, but hardened, with a haunted look in his eyes. Maddie recognized him instantly. It was Billy, the young man from Stone's gang, the one who had stood up to Stone that night. "I need to talk to you," Billy said, his voice hesitant, his gaze shifting between Garrett and Maddie. And to Mrs. Mercer. Garrett hesitated, his eyes questioning, his instincts warning him of danger. But he also saw the desperation in Billy's eyes, the vulnerability, the genuine need for help. "All right," Garrett said, his voice cautious. "But keep your hands where I can see them." Billy nodded, his hands raised slightly, showing that he was unarmed. He approached the porch, where Maddie was standing, her own rifle held loosely in her hands. "Mrs. Mercer," Billy said, his voice respectful, his gaze meeting hers. I need your help." "What is it, Billy?" Maddie asked, her voice calm, but wary. Billy hesitated, his gaze shifting to Garrett, then back to Maddie. "It's about Stone," he said, his voice low.
He's planning something.
"Something big." The words sent a chill through Maddie. She had known Stone wouldn't give up easily, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that he was planning something big, it filled her with a sense of dread. "What is he planning?" Garrett asked, his voice sharp, his eyes focused intently on Billy. He's going to raid your ranch," Billy said, his voice trembling. "He's going to steal your cattle, burn your buildings, drive you off your land." Maddie's breath caught in her throat. The threat was real, imminent, terrifying. She looked at Garrett, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination.
"When?"
Garrett asked, his voice urgent. "Tonight," Billy said, his voice barely a whisper. Under the cover of darkness. The information was shocking, devastating. They had little time to prepare, little time to react. They were outnumbered, outgunned, facing a ruthless enemy who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. "Why are you telling us this, Billy?" Maddie asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "Why betray Stone?" Billy looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. "Because it's wrong," he said, his voice firm. "Because I don't want to be a part of it. Because I saw the way you looked at him," he gestured to Garrett, "that night. The way you stood by her. I want to be on the right side for once." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such raw honesty, touched Maddie. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the yearning for redemption, the desire to make amends for his past mistakes. "We believe you, Billy," she said, and turned to Garrett. He nodded. "We need a plan," Garrett said, his mind racing, calculating the odds, assessing their options. "We can't fight them alone." "I can help," Billy offered, his voice hesitant. "I know Stone's plan, I know his men, I know the terrain." He hesitated. "But why being here?"
"The law."
Maddie thought quickly. "Sheriff Thompson won't help, not against Stone. But I'm not asking you to break the law you ran from, just help us defend ourselves." "Does that change things?" Billy looked down, thinking. He shuffled his feet, then looked up, first at Garrett, then at Maddie. "Yes, ma'am."
"It does."
Chapter 15. The bitter taste of betrayal. Billy's information, though a lifeline, also cast a long, dark shadow of urgency over the ranch. The night was fast approaching, and with it, Stone's planned attack. They had to act quickly, to prepare, to devise a strategy that would give them even a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. "We need to move the cattle," Garrett said, his voice decisive, his mind already formulating a plan. "Get them to a safer location, somewhere Stone won't find them." "The North Canyon," Maddie suggested, her voice firm, her knowledge of the land proving invaluable. "It's narrow, easily defensible, and hidden from view." "Good," Garrett agreed. "Billy, you know Stone's men. How many are we talking about?" "At least a dozen," Billy said, his voice grim. "Maybe more. He's been recruiting, offering good money to anyone willing to ride with him." The numbers were daunting, far more than Maddie, Garrett, and Billy could handle alone. They needed help, but who could they trust? Sheriff Thompson was out of the question, and most of the townsfolk were either intimidated by Stone or secretly in his pocket. "We have a few loyal hands," Maddie said, her voice thoughtful. "Old timers mostly, but they're good men, reliable, and they know how to handle a rifle." "Get them," Garrett said. "Every gun counts." Maddie nodded and hurried off to gather the ranch hands, a small group of weathered, seasoned men who had been with the Mercer family for years. They were loyal, trustworthy, and fiercely protective of Maddie and her land. While Maddie was gathering the hands, Garrett and Billy worked on fortifying the ranch house, barricading the windows, reinforcing the doors, preparing for a siege. They worked quickly, efficiently, their movements practiced, their silence punctuated only by the hammering of nails and the rasp of wood. As they worked, Garrett studied Billy, assessing his trustworthiness, his reliability. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the yearning for redemption, the determination to make amends for his past mistakes. But he also saw the fear, the uncertainty, the lingering doubt. "You don't have to do this, Billy," Garrett said, his voice low, his gaze meeting the younger man's. "You could right away disappear. No one would blame you." Billy shook his head, his expression determined.
"I can't," he said, his voice firm.
"I have to do this. I have to make things right." Garrett nodded, understanding the need for redemption, the yearning for a clean slate. He had felt it himself, that desperate desire to escape the darkness of his past, to build something new, something good. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Maddie returned with the ranch hands, a small but determined group, armed with rifles and shotguns, ready to defend their home, their livelihood, their way of life. They gathered in the main house, the atmosphere tense, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Garrett outlined the plan, his voice calm and authoritative, his instructions clear and concise. They would defend the house, using the terrain to their advantage, making Stone pay dearly for every inch of ground he gained. As darkness fell, a heavy silence descended over the ranch, a silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, and the nervous whispers of the defenders. They waited, their eyes scanning the horizon, their senses alert, their fingers tightening on their weapons. The attack came suddenly, without warning. A volley of shots rang out, shattering the windows, splintering the wood, sending bullets whizzing through the air. The defenders returned fire, the roar of gunfire echoing through the night, the flashes illuminating the landscape in brief, blinding bursts. The battle raged, fierce and brutal. Stone's men, fueled by greed and a thirst for revenge, attacked relentlessly, trying to breach the defenses, to overwhelm the outnumbered defenders. But Maddie, Garrett, Billy, and the ranch hands fought back with a courage and determination born of desperation and a fierce love for their land. Suddenly, a cry rang out, a cry of pain, of anguish. One of the ranch hands, Old Man Jenkins, had been hit. He lay on the floor, clutching his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. Maddie rushed to his side, her heart filled with fear and sorrow. She knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Hang on, Jenkins," she said, her voice trembling. "You're going to be all right." But she knew it was a lie. The wound was deep, mortal. Jenkins looked at her, his eyes filled with a fading light. "It's all right, Maddie," he whispered, his voice weak. "I fought for what I believed in." He took a final, shuddering breath, and then he was gone. Maddie closed his eyes, her tears falling onto his weathered face. She had lost a friend, a loyal companion, a man who had been like family to her. The loss fueled her anger, her determination, her resolve to fight on, to avenge Jenkins' death, to protect her home, her land, her life. But then, a shocking betrayal. As Garrett moved to cover a shattered window, Billy raised his own weapon and pointed it straight at Garrett's back. The bitter taste of deceit filled the air, thicker and more suffocating than the gun smoke. Chapter 16. A promise made under a starry canopy. The sight of Billy, his face contorted in a mixture of fear and grim determination, aiming a gun at Garrett's back, sent a wave of ice through Maddie's veins. It was a betrayal so profound, so unexpected, that it momentarily paralyzed her.
"Billy, no,"
she screamed, her voice raw with anguish and disbelief. But her cry came too late. Billy squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night, a deafening roar that seemed to shatter the very foundations of her world. However, the bullet didn't find its intended target. At the last possible second, Garrett, sensing something amiss, spun around, deflecting Billy's aim with his arm. The bullet grazed a shoulder, tearing through flesh and fabric, but missing anything vital. Garrett, fueled by adrenaline and a surge of anger, tackled Billy, wresting the gun from his grasp. They struggled briefly, a tangle of limbs and desperate grunts, before Garrett overpowered him, pinning him to the ground, his gun pressed against Billy's head. "Why, Billy?" Garrett growled, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and betrayal. "Why did you do it?" Billy looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears, his face contorted with shame and regret. I had no choice," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Stone, he has my sister. He said he'd kill her if I didn't help him." The words, spoken with such desperate sincerity, such raw anguish, stunned Garrett. He hesitated, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. He saw the genuine fear in Billy's eyes, the torment, the desperation of a man forced to make an impossible choice. Maddie, who had been tending to Jenkins' body, rushed to Garrett's side, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happened?" Garrett explained Billy's betrayal, his forced collaboration with Stone, the threat to his sister's life. Maddie listened, her heart aching for Billy, for the impossible situation he was in, for the agonizing choice he had been forced to make. "We have to help him, Garrett," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. "We have to save his sister." Garrett hesitated, his mind still reeling from the betrayal, his instincts warning him of danger. But he also saw the genuine remorse in Billy's eyes, the desperation, the plea for help. And he saw the compassion in Maddie's eyes, the unwavering belief in the goodness of people, the refusal to abandon someone in need. "All right," Garrett said, his voice grudging, his grip on the gun relaxing. "We'll help you, Billy. But you have to tell us everything. Where is Stone holding your sister?" Billy, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, nodded eagerly. He's got her at the old abandoned mine," he said, his voice trembling. "North of here, about 5 miles. He's using it as a hideout." The information was crucial, a lifeline. They had a location, a target, a chance to rescue Billy's sister and put an end to Stone's reign of terror. "We'll go tonight," Garrett said, his voice decisive, his mind already formulating a plan. "Under the cover of darkness. We'll surprise him, take him down." Maddie nodded, her agreement firm, her resolve strengthened by the need to help Billy, to save his sister, to bring justice to Stone. They quickly bandaged Garrett's wounded shoulder, the pain a constant reminder of Billy's betrayal, but also a symbol of the sacrifices they were willing to make for each other, for what was right. As they prepared to leave, under the vast, starry canopy of the night sky, Garrett turned to Billy, his eyes searching his. "I'm trusting you, Billy," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't betray us again." Billy looked at him, his eyes filled with a newfound determination, a genuine commitment to redemption. "I won't," he said, his voice firm. "I swear it. I'll help you get Stone, and then I want out. I'm done with that life." Maddie placed a hand on Billy's shoulder, then looked at Garrett. "We all deserve a second chance," she murmured, more to Garrett than Billy. And with that, they set off into the night, the three of them, an unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of betrayal and desperation, united by a common goal, to rescue Billy's sister, to defeat Stone, to bring justice to the lawless land. The stars, silent witnesses to their struggles, seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, a promise of a brighter future, a future where loyalty, courage, and love could triumph over greed, hatred, and betrayal. Chapter 17. Where Rivers Run Red with Regret. The ride to the abandoned mine was tense and silent, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the weight of their mission. The moon, hidden behind a veil of clouds, offered little illumination, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the rugged terrain. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, metallic tang of the old mine. Garrett led the way, his injured shoulder throbbing, his senses alert, his gun held ready. Maddie rode beside him, her rifle across her lap, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Billy followed close behind, his expression grim, his guilt and regret a palpable presence. As they approached the mine, Garrett signaled for them to stop. They dismounted, tying their horses to a cluster of scrub brush, hidden from view. "Stay close," Garrett whispered, his voice barely audible. "And stay quiet. Stone will have guards posted." They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth, their eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of danger. The mine entrance was a gaping maw in the side of the hill, a dark, ominous hole that seemed to breathe with a malevolent energy. The remnants of old mining equipment lay scattered around, rusted and broken, a testament to a bygone era of hope and greed. Garrett signaled for Billy to lead the way. Billy, familiar with the layout of the mine, moved forward, his steps hesitant, his body tense. He led them through a narrow tunnel, the air growing thick and heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. They heard voices ahead, the muffled sounds of men talking, laughing, unaware of their impending arrival. Garrett signaled for them to stop. He peered around a corner, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw a group of men, Stone's henchmen, gathered around a makeshift campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were drinking, gambling, and talking, their voices loud and boisterous. And, tied to a post some distance away, he saw the young woman Billy's sister. Garrett retreated, his mind racing, formulating a plan. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise. They had to act quickly, decisively, before the guards became aware of their presence. "Billy, you take the one on the far left," Garrett whispered, his voice urgent. "Maddie, you cover me. I'll go for Stone." They nodded, their faces grim, their hearts pounding. They knew the risks, the danger, the potential for failure. But they also knew they had no choice. They had to rescue Billy's sister, to stop Stone, to bring justice to this lawless land. Garrett took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. He nodded to Maddie and Billy, and then, with a sudden burst of speed, he charged into the clearing, his gun blazing. The guards, taken completely by surprise, reacted slowly, fumbling for their weapons, their drunken stupor hindering their movements. Garrett shot 2 of them before they could even raise their guns, the bullets finding their targets with deadly accuracy. Maddie followed close behind, her rifle spitting fire, her aim true. She shot another guard, the bullet striking him in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Billy, fueled by a desperate courage, charged towards the remaining guards, his fists flying, his anger unleashed. He knocked one guard unconscious with a swift punch to the jaw, then wrestled another to the ground, disarming him. The battle was short, sharp, and brutal. Stone's men, caught off guard and unprepared, were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes it was over. The clearing was silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the victors. Garrett, his shoulder throbbing, his body covered in sweat and grime, approached Stone, who was lying on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face contorted in pain and rage. "It's over, Stone," Garrett said, his voice cold, his gun pointed at the man's head. Stone looked up at him, his eyes filled with hatred, with defiance, with the bitter taste of defeat. "You won't get away with this," he gasped, his voice weak. "We already have," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. He turned away, leaving Stone to his fate. He had no desire to kill the man, to stoop to his level. Justice would be served, in its own way, in its own time. Maddie and Billy were untying the young woman. She looked at Billy, then at Maddie and Garrett with tears in her eyes. "I will never be able to repay you," she said. Garrett holstered his weapon. "Head north. Get as far from here as you can," Garrett said. The river was behind them as they walked away, back toward the ranch. But Maddie could almost hear it, rushing, tumbling, carrying away the silt, the mud, and, she hoped, the lingering regrets, leaving only a clean, clear stream in its wake. Chapter 18. The Ghosts of Yesterday's Choices. The return to the ranch was somber, despite their victory. The weight of the night's events, the violence, the the bloodshed, the near constant threat of death, hung heavy in the air. They had rescued Billy's sister, defeated Stone, and brought a semblance of justice to their corner of the world, but the cost had been high. Jenkins was dead, Garrett was wounded, and the scars of the night, both physical and emotional, would linger. The ranch house, once a symbol of safety and stability, now bore the marks of battle, its windows shattered, its walls riddled with bullet holes. They buried Jenkins the next morning, under the shade of a lone mesquite tree, overlooking the vast expanse of the ranch he had loved and served so faithfully. Maddie delivered a simple eulogy, her voice choked with emotion, her tears falling onto the freshly turned earth. "He was a good man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Loyal, trustworthy, and brave. He died defending his home, his friends, his way of life. He will be missed." Garrett stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a silent comfort, a source of strength. He, too, felt the loss of Jenkins, the weight of responsibility for the old man's death. After the burial, they set about repairing the damage to the ranch house, boarding up the windows, patching the holes in the walls, trying to restore a sense of normalcy, of order, to their shattered world. As they worked, Maddie noticed a change in Garrett. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn, his eyes filled with a haunted look, a darkness that seemed to have deepened since the night's events. She knew he was struggling, grappling with the violence he had witnessed, with the choices he had made, with the ghosts of his past that continued to haunt him. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Maddie decided to confront him. "You're quiet," she said, her voice gentle, her gaze meeting his. "What's going on in that head of yours?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "I keep seeing their faces," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The men I killed. Stone's men." Maddie nodded, understanding his torment. She, too, had seen those faces, had felt the weight of taking a life, even in self-defense, even in the pursuit of justice. "They were trying to kill us, Garrett," she said, her voice firm. "They were trying to take everything we hold dear. You did what you had to do." "I know," he said, his voice filled with self-doubt. "But it doesn't make it any easier. I thought I was past all that I could leave that life behind." "You can," Maddie said, her voice unwavering. "You have. You're a different man now, Garrett. You're a good man." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking reassurance, seeking forgiveness, seeking a way to escape the darkness that threatened to consume him. "I don't know, Maddie," he said, his voice filled with despair. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that same person, that I'm just pretending." "You're not pretending," Maddie said, her voice fierce, her grip tightening on his hand. "You're changing. You're growing. You're becoming the man you were always meant to be." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, her eyes locked with his. "We all have ghosts, Garrett," she said, her voice soft. "We all have regrets. But we can't let them define us. We have to learn from them, to move on, to find a way to forgive ourselves." He closed his eyes, his body trembling, his emotions raw and exposed. He leaned into her, seeking comfort, seeking solace, seeking the strength to face his demons. "I love you, Maddie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you more than anything." The words, spoken with such vulnerability, such sincerity, brought tears to Maddie's eyes. She had waited so long to hear those words, to feel this connection, to find this love. "I love you too, Garrett," she said, her voice equally emotional, her heart overflowing with a love that was both fierce and fragile. They held each other close, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating as one. The ghosts of yesterday's choices still lingered, but in that moment, in that embrace, they found a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future where love, forgiveness, and redemption could triumph over the darkness of the past. And the sun, setting in a final blaze of glory, seemed to cast long, healing rays across the whole, wide land. Chapter 19. A Reckoning Under the Desert Sun. The news of Stone's defeat and capture spread quickly through the territory, carried on the wind, whispered in saloons, and shared around campfires. Sheriff Thompson, spurred into action by the overwhelming evidence and the public outcry, finally arrested Stone and his remaining men, charging them with attempted murder, robbery, and a litany of other crimes. The townsfolk, emboldened by Stone's downfall, turned against him, their fear replaced by a newfound courage, a desire for justice. They had lived under his shadow for too long, intimidated by his power, silenced by his threats. Now they were ready to speak out, to testify, to ensure that he would never again terrorize their community. Maddie and Garrett, though relieved by Stone's arrest, knew that the legal process would be long and arduous. Thompson, despite his newfound zeal, was still a flawed lawman, susceptible to corruption and influence. They couldn't rely on him to ensure that justice was served. They decided to take matters into their own hands, to gather evidence, to interview witnesses, to build an airtight case against Stone. They traveled throughout the territory, talking to ranchers, farmers, and townsfolk, collecting stories of Stone's crimes, his intimidation tactics, his ruthless pursuit of power and wealth. Their investigation led them to uncover a web of corruption that extended far beyond Stone, reaching into the highest levels of local government. They discovered that Stone had been bribing officials, buying influence, and manipulating the law to his advantage. Their efforts were met with resistance, with threats, with attempts to silence them. But they persevered, driven by a fierce determination to bring justice to Stone and to expose the corruption that had allowed him to flourish. One day, while they were returning from a long and frustrating day of investigation, they were ambushed. A group of men, masked and armed, emerged from a hidden canyon, their guns blazing. Maddie and Garrett, caught off guard, reacted quickly, diving for cover, returning fire. The shootout was intense, brutal, a desperate fight for survival. They were outnumbered, but they fought with a courage and skill born of years of living on the edge, of facing danger, of defending their lives and their land. Garrett, despite his lingering shoulder wound, fought with a fierce determination, his aim true, his movements precise. Maddie, her heart pounding with fear, fought beside him, her rifle spitting fire, her courage unwavering. They managed to repel the attackers, killing several of them, forcing the rest to retreat. But they knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The ambush was a clear message, a warning that they were getting too close to the truth, that their investigation was threatening powerful interests. As they rode back to the ranch, exhausted and shaken, Maddie turned to Garrett, her eyes filled with concern. "This is getting too dangerous, Garrett," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this. We're going to get ourselves killed." Garrett nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but we can't stop now. We're too close. We have to see this through." "But at what cost?" Maddie asked, her voice filled with anguish. "Is it worth risking our lives, our future, for this?" Garrett looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his heart aching with the weight of their choices. "It's not just about us, Maddie," he said, his voice firm. "It's about justice. It's about doing what's right. It's about making this land a better place, a safer place for everyone." His words, spoken with such conviction, such sincerity, resonated with Maddie. She knew he was right. They couldn't back down, they couldn't give up, not now, not when they were so close to achieving their goal. Under a massive, cloudless, blazing desert sky, they chose. They would present all they had gathered to a judge, newly appointed from further east, a man reputed to be incorruptible. It was a risk, a huge risk, but they were through running. They would stand and fight for their future. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The day of the hearing arrived, hot and dry, the air thick with anticipation and tension. The small courtroom, usually empty and echoing, was packed with townsfolk, ranchers, and farmers, all eager to witness the final reckoning, the culmination of years of struggle, of fear, of oppression. Maddie and Garrett, dressed in their best clothes, stood before Judge Thompson, no relation to the Sheriff, a stern, imposing figure with a reputation for fairness and integrity. He had been brought in specifically for this case, a sign that the territorial governor was taking the matter seriously, that he was determined to root out the corruption that had plagued the region. The evidence against Stone was overwhelming. Maddie and Garrett presented their findings, the testimonies they had gathered, the documents they had uncovered, all painting a damning picture of Stone's crimes, his ruthlessness, his manipulation of the law. Stone, seated at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair, watched the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. He had underestimated Maddie and Garrett, had underestimated their determination, their courage, their unwavering pursuit of justice. His lawyer, a slick, well-paid man from the city, attempted to discredit the evidence, to cast doubt on the witnesses, to portray Stone as a victim of a vendetta. But his efforts were futile. The truth was too clear, too compelling, too overwhelming. The turning point came when Billy, accompanied by his sister, took the stand. He recounted his story, his forced collaboration with Stone, the threat to his sister's life, his ultimate decision to betray Stone and help Maddie and Garrett. His testimony, delivered with a raw honesty and a genuine remorse, was devastating. It exposed Stone's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his willingness to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goals. Stone, realizing that he was cornered, that his defense was crumbling, lost his composure. He stood up, his face red with rage, his eyes blazing with fury. "It's all lies," he roared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "They're all lying. They're trying to frame me." Judge Thompson slammed his gavel, his voice booming, his authority unquestionable. "Silence," he commanded. "You will maintain order in this court, or you will be held in contempt." Stone, cowed by the judge's stern rebuke, sank back into his chair, his defiance shattered, his spirit broken. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, delivered his verdict. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice cold and unwavering, "I find you guilty on all counts. You are a disgrace to this territory, a cancer on this community. You have used your power and wealth to intimidate, to manipulate, to oppress. You have shown no remorse, no regret for your crimes." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, his eyes filled with a righteous anger. "I sentence you to life in prison," he said, his voice booming. "May God have mercy on your soul." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of cheers, of applause, of relief. Justice had been served. Stone's reign of terror was over. Maddie and Garrett, standing side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, of triumph, of vindication. They had faced overwhelming odds, had risked their lives, their future, to bring Stone to justice. And they had succeeded. As Stone was led away, his head hung low, his spirit crushed, Maddie and Garrett walked out of the courtroom, into the bright sunshine, into a new beginning. The townsfolk gathered around them, congratulating them, thanking them, praising their courage, their determination, their unwavering pursuit of justice. Maddie and Garrett, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, smiled and nodded, their hearts filled with gratitude, with a sense of accomplishment, with a profound sense of peace. They had faced their demons, had confronted their past, had fought for what they believed in. And they had emerged victorious, stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever before. The horizon stretched before them, vast and limitless, a symbol of the future, of the possibilities, of the life they would build together on the ranch, under the wide open sky, where justice had finally prevailed and where love had found a home. The trial, the verdict, the reactions, had all unfolded under that same blazing sun. But now, finally, it no longer felt harsh and oppressive. It felt, instead, like a warm and welcoming promise. Epilogue. The years that followed were kind to Maddie and Garrett. The ranch prospered, their love deepened, and the scars of the past, though they never completely faded, became a testament to their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other. They rebuilt the ranch house, making it stronger, more beautiful, a symbol of their renewed hope, their shared future. They expanded the herd, improved the land, and built a life that was both fulfilling and peaceful. They never forgot the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made, the battles they had fought. They remained vigilant, protective of their land, their community, their way of life. They became pillars of the community, respected and admired for their courage, their integrity, their unwavering commitment to justice. They helped their neighbors, supported the less fortunate, and worked to create a better future for the generations to come. Billy and his sister, freed from Stone's grip, built a new life for themselves, far away from the troubles of the past. They stayed in touch with Maddie and Garrett, their gratitude and friendship enduring. Sheriff Thompson, facing mounting pressure from the territorial governor and the outraged citizenry, was eventually removed from office, replaced by a younger, more honest, more dedicated lawman. The territory slowly began to change, to evolve. The lawlessness of the past gradually gave way to a more ordered, more civilized society. The railroads arrived, bringing with them new opportunities, new challenges, and a new era of progress. But Maddie and Garrett remained rooted in the land, in the traditions, in the values that had sustained them through the years. They embraced the changes, but they never forgot who they were, where they came from, what they had fought for. One evening, many years later, Maddie and Garrett were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a blaze of color, a breathtaking spectacle that never failed to stir their souls. Maddie, her hair now completely silver, her face lined with the wisdom of age, her eyes still sparkling with the same fierce spirit, leaned against Garrett, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. "We did it, Garrett," she said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We built a good life." Garrett nodded, his eyes filled with a deep love, a profound gratitude for the woman who had stood by him, who had believed in him, who had helped him find redemption. "We did, Maddie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We did it together." They sat in silence, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding. They had faced the darkness, had conquered their demons, had found love and happiness in the most unlikely of places. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple, they knew that their love, like the land they cherished, would endure, a testament to their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to each other. The vast, starry canopy above them seemed to stretch on forever, a silent witness to a love